Hello everyone. In my list of 16 forcing chess moves, one of the moves is called an anomalous move. And here I want to show you a perfect example which just happened in the European Championship against Timur Rajabov and Neopominachi. And I'll put a link to that video in the description below and maybe at the end of this video. The way I define anomalous moves are moves to look for in the presence of power moves. And if you haven't looked at that video on the 6 power moves, on how to find tactics with the 6 power moves, I'll also put a link for that video in the description below. But the power moves are the basic forcing moves of chess. And when I made that discovery, I started beating experts in tournament play. And you're going to see why in the next sequence of moves here. But first I want to say is that this site focuses on the middle game, because there are plenty of sites where you can practice tactics. But you really need to learn my 6 power move concept in order to find them and how to use them really well during games. You look for these features. You can actually ask this list of questions, and then you can find great tactics by doing so. You'll see that I also show that you have to look for them in 1 and then in 2 moves. And that really takes it to a whole other level. And a lot of you guys are not just suffering from positional and strategic understanding, but you also need to get your tactics up to a certain level as well. Okay, so here's the game. When you evaluate the board, you need to look at the strengths and weaknesses in a position, both from your side and your opponent's side of the board. So white just moved queen to d1. Let's take a quick look at the position here. Notice that white has a passed pawn, which is power move number 6. And that already signals a feature for you to start looking for anomalous moves, which are other power moves that you can do in 1 and 2 moves. So with this queen to d1 move, there are possible threats of bringing the queen down to d7. Try and push this pawn through. So black plays bishop to d4, blocking the queen and maybe hoping to push this pawn and try and lock that bishop in there. And of course, you should always be looking at the threats of your opponent's previous move and also the weaknesses in his move, because every move has a strength and weakness. It gives up the protection of a square or the defense of a piece. So after we've determined that this bishop move was primarily defensive and we don't see any threats that black can make against the white pieces, you start looking for offensive moves. But I actually just noticed that this bishop had a secondary purpose. It's actually a preparation for power move number 5. Little guys harassing big guys. It can move to e3, harassing the rook at some point. So it had a secondary purpose as well. So you combine the 3 features that I just mentioned. This passed pawn, power moves in 1 and 2, and which squares this bishop may no longer be defending. Neopominachi is a very strong Russian grandmaster with the black pieces, but he overlooked this evaluation, which Rajabov saw. So the bishop now is no longer defending the d6 square, and the power moves are in a hierarchy. So you look, and it starts with check. Checks in 1, and then checks in 2. And the only possible white piece that can do that is the knight. So you look for checks in 1 and 2 with the knight, and whether or not those squares are defended by the enemy pieces. This allows you to find tactical brilliancies. So why don't you pause the video and look at all the checks that you can find in 1 and 2 moves with the knight. So pause the video. So you might go 1, 2. That would be a check. Of course, you would lose your knight with that first move. So then you go the other way. You go, wow, maybe I can go here, but the queen is here. And we just take the knight, right? Well, this is where the anomalous feature comes into play. If the knight moves here and the queen captures, this pawn can drive all the way home. But also deadly is that if the queen doesn't take the knight can swing to e8, forking the queen and king. But our main goal is to actually try to promote this pawn to a queen. But the queen is blocking its path, so we have to try to get the queen out of there, which was the main purpose of this knight move. Of course, if you get really lucky and your opponent doesn't see the other threats, like this fork, or if the queen captures, you will be able to realize your true intention. So black saw all of these threats and moved the king out of the checking square. And now white was able to slide the knight over to b5, forking the queen and bishop. And now with good technique, it's game over. So the rook takes the knight, pawn takes, pawn defends the bishop, white plays queen to b3 to try to worm the way queen into the enemy position, maybe queen here and then up. King to g7, defending the pawn, free the queen up, queen to d5, bishop to e3, hitting the rook. You see, I told you that was the other reason the bishop moved to d4, so that it could attack the rook later. That's what these grandmasters are looking at, power moves in 1 and power moves in 2. Rook moves, doubling up. There's really nothing black can do. He has no counter chances. Queen to b8, rook hits the bishop, bishop goes back. And now for a little pawn shredding, and black resigns. If the pawn takes, the bishop drops. And if he doesn't take, we get to take, and we open up the position. Not everything happens with the same frequency in chess, and I contend that the 6 power moves and their preparation accounts for about 80% of what goes on in a chess battle. And I am just pulling that figure out of a hat, but maybe one of you can do a study and go over about 100 games and see how often power moves and their preparation are used to gain a strategic or tactical advantage. Anyway, I hope this was useful to you, and I'll see you in the next video.